In the late autumn of 1977, in the rugged, windswept high country of western Nebraska, a man named Silas Thorne started doing something that made his neighbors think he'd finally lost his mind. Silas wasn't a stranger to the harsh winters of the plains, but that year, he began constructing what he called his double cabin, a strange, reinforced structure built of thick cedar logs and wrapped in an outer shell of heavy corrugated steel, leaving a 3-foot gap of dead air between the two walls. To the local ranching community outside the small town of Crawford, Silas looked like he was building a tomb, or perhaps just wasting good money on a paranoid fantasy, especially since the previous 3 winters had been unusually mild and sunny. His closest neighbor, a man named Miller, would often pull his truck over by the fence line just to watch Silas hauling massive crates of canned goods, medical supplies, and literal tons of dry firewood into this bizarre, windowless fortress. Miller and the others would joke at the local diner about Silas preparing for the end of the world, when the only thing on the horizon was a clear blue sky and the gentle rustle of the prairie grass. They called it Thorne's Folly, laughing at the sight of a man spending his life savings on insulation and emergency generators while they spent theirs on new cattle and summer vacations. Silas never argued back. He just kept reinforcing the roof with heavy steel beams and checking the seals on his massive industrial-grade pantry doors, almost as if he could hear a sound on the wind that no one else could. He knew that the Great Plains don't give warnings, they give lessons. And he had a feeling that the debt of those 3 mild years was about to be collected in full. By the middle of November, while the rest of the town was planning their Thanksgiving dinners and leaving their livestock out in the open pastures, Silas moved into his double cabin and locked the heavy internal bolts. The neighbors laughed one last time as they saw the smoke rising from his chimney on a perfectly clear, 50-degree afternoon, never imagining that within 48 hours, the sky would turn a bruised, terrifying purple and the temperature would drop 60 degrees in a single afternoon. They didn't know that the double cabin wasn't a joke. But the only thing that stood between life and a freezing whiteout gray, the laughter stopped on the morning of November 9th, when the great blizzard of '77 slammed into the Nebraska panhandle with a violence that had been seen in a generation, turning the world into a screaming wall of white. Within 2 hours, the roads were gone, buried under drifts that reached the rooftops of standard farmhouses, and the wind was howling at 70 miles per hour, stripping the paint off of barns and freezing the breath inside people's lungs. Silas sat inside his double cabin, listening to the roar of the wind. But thanks to his strange wall-within-a-wall design, the interior remained a steady flickering warmth of 65 degrees, while the outside world plummeted to 30 below zero. He had enough fuel to run his specialized ventilation system, which was designed not to clog with the fine, flour-like snow that was currently suffocating every other chimney in the county. As the first night fell, the power lines snapped like toothpicks under the weight of the ice, plunging the entire region into a terrifying, frozen darkness that disconnected families and left thousands of cattle to huddle together until they froze where they stood. Miller, the neighbor who had laughed the loudest, found himself trapped in his kitchen as the snow pressed against his windows until the glass shattered under the pressure, forcing him and his wife into a tiny cellar with nothing but a single blanket and a dying flashlight. The storm wasn't just a heavy snowfall. It was a physical weight, a crushing atmospheric event that made it impossible to see your own hand in front of your face. Yet Silas remained in his cocoon of cedar and steel, checking his barometers and waiting. He knew the worst was yet to come, because the atmospheric pressure was still dropping, signaling that this was passing front but a week-long siege that would test the very limits of human survival. While the town of Crawford disappeared under 20-foot drifts, Silas Thorne sat in the golden glow of his lantern, the only man in the county who was currently praying for a miracle he had prepared for. But as the third day dawned, with no end in sight, Silas heard a frantic, muffled thumping against his outer steel huller sound that shouldn't have been possible in a storm that killed anything caught outside in minutes. The silent siege of Crawford. The sound Silas heard wasn't a person, at least not at first. It was the rhythmic, metallic clanging of a piece of debris caught in the vortex between his 2 cupboard walls. But it alerted him to something much more dire. The air intake for his generator was starting to ice over. If that intake froze solid, the carbon monoxide would back up into his living quarters, turning his fortress into the very tomb his neighbors had joked about just weeks prior. Silas had to make a choice that went against every instinct of survival. He had to open the inner airlock and crawl into the freezing gap space to clear the ice, exposing himself to the lethal drafts that were whistling through the outer steel rivets. As he pulled on his heavy furs and cracked the inner door, the sheer force of the cold hit him like a physical blow, a reminder that nature was currently trying to erase everything human from the map of Nebraska. He managed to clear the ice, his fingers numbing instantly despite his gloves. But as he turned to retreat back into the warmth, he saw a flickering light through a tiny reinforced porthole in his outer wall aflare. Weak and desperate, coming from the direction of the Miller Ranch. It was a cry for help in a storm where help was a death sentence, and Silas knew that even with his double cavern, he couldn't just sit by while his neighbors were buried alive. He realized that the double cavern wasn't just a house. It had become a lighthouse in a sea of white death. And he was the only person with the supplies and the structural integrity to act as a rescue hub. He spent the next 4 hours rigging a safety line of high-tensile steel cable. He had anchored deep into the concrete foundation months ago and prepared himself to step out into the void. The wind was so strong, it felt like it was trying to peel the skin off his face. And the snow was so thick, he had to wear aviator goggles just to keep his eyes open. But he began to haul himself toward the direction of that dying flare. Every foot he traveled felt like a mile, the cold seeping through layers of wool and leather. But his obsession with preparation had given him one final tool, a portable, high-frequency radio he had tuned to the local emergency band. As he struggled through the drifts, he heard a crackling voice on the radio, the local sheriff. Hunkered down in a dying jeep, calling out names of families who hadn't checked in, and the list was terrifyingly long. Silas reached the edge of the Miller property only to find that the main house was almost entirely submerged, with only the tip of the chimney peeking out like a tombstone in the snow. He didn't find the Millers in the house. He found them huddled in the bed of their truck, which they had tried to use as a last resort shelter before the engine froze and the cabin became a refrigerator. They were in the advanced stages of hypothermia, drifting into that dangerous sleep that precedes death, and Silas had to physically drag them, one by one, back along his steel cable toward the double cabin. The journey back was a nightmare of endurance. The wind had shifted, blowing directly into their faces, and Miller's wife was nearly unconscious, her weight a leaden anchor in the waist-deep powder. Silas's lungs burned with every breath of the sub-zero air, and his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. But the thought of his warm cedar-lined sanctuary kept him moving inch by inch. When they finally reached the airlock of the double cabin, Silas practically threw them inside, sealing the heavy bolts and cranking the heat to its maximum setting. As the warmth began to color their gray, frozen skin, Miller looked around at the shelves of food, the roaring stove, and the reinforced walls he had once mocked, and he started to weep. Not from the pain of the thawing, but from the crushing weight of his own realization. They were safe, but the radio was still crackling with the names of others who weren't. And the storm showed no signs of breaking even after 4 days of continuous fury. Silas looked at his supplies and realized that while he had prepared for one man to survive for months, he was now responsible for 3, and the double cabin was about to become a crowded, high-stakes hospital in the middle of a wasteland. The 7-day resurrection. By the 5th day, the storm had reached a fever pitch, with barometric pressures dropping to record lows that caused the very wood of the cabin to groan and pop under the atmospheric stress. Silas's Miller and his wife were now joined by 2 more survivors, a young hiker Silas, his I.O. had miraculously spotted near his fence line, and a local deputy whose snowmobile had died a mile out. The double cabin, once a symbol of one man's solitary paranoia, was now a packed lifeboat, and Silas was the captain, rationing the heat and the food with a disciplined hand to ensure they could last if the blizzard stretched into a second week. They spent the hours in a strange, hushed state of existence, listening to the shrieking wind outside that sounded like a choir of ghosts, while Silas taught them how to maintain the ventilation and monitor the external sensors he'd installed. The tension was thick. Every time the wind surged, the steel outer shell would vibrate with a low-frequency hum that made their teeth ache, a constant reminder that only a few inches of metal and dead air separated them from a frozen end. Miller, once the town's most vocal skeptic, spent his time sharpening Silas's tools and helping organize the pantry, his face the mask of quiet humility as he realized that the man he'd laughed at was the only reason his children still had a father. On the 6th day, the fuel for the main generator began to run low, forcing Silas to switch to a manual wood-burning backup system that required constant attention and produced a thick, sweet-smelling smoke that was the only sign of life for 50 miles. They took turns stoking the fire, their shadows dancing on the cedar walls, sharing stories of the lives they had lived before the whiteout, back when the world felt permanent and safe. It was during these quiet moments that the double cabin felt less like a fortress and more like a sacred space, a testament to the idea that foresight isn't just about surviving, but about holding a space for others when the world falls apart. On the morning of the 7th day, the wind didn't just die down, it vanished, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy in the ears of the survivors. Silas cracked the outer hatch, which was now buried under 15 feet of snow, and they had to spend 4 hours digging a vertical tunnel just to see the sky. When they finally broke through to the surface, the sight was breathtaking and horrifying. The rolling hills of Nebraska were gone, replaced by a jagged, alien landscape of white peaks and deep, shadowed blue valleys. The sun hit the snow with a blinding brilliance, reflecting off a world that had been completely redesigned by the wind, with power lines, fences, and roads nowhere to be found. They stood on top of the double cabin's roof, looking out over the Crawford Valley, and saw that many of the surrounding farmhouses were completely invisible, their locations marked only by the faintest wisps of smoke or the tips of tall trees. National Guard helicopters began to appear on the horizon within hours, their rotors thumping through the still air as they dropped supplies and looked for signs of life in a county that had been effectively erased. Silas Thorne's double cavern became the base of operations for the rescue teams in that sector, its reinforced structure providing a safe landing zone and a warm staging area for the exhausted soldiers. When the story eventually came out, Silas didn't want the fame or the title of a hero. He simply went back to his ranching, though he noticed that the laughter at the diner had stopped for good. In fact, by the following autumn, several of his neighbors were seen hauling heavy cedar logs and corrugated steel out to their own properties, quietly asking Silas for his double cabin blueprints. Silas Thorne's legacy isn't just a story of a storm, but a reminder that the world belongs to those who see the clouds on the horizon while everyone else is looking at the sun. If you found this story of survival and foresight incredible, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the forgotten legends of the American frontier. What would you have done in Silas's shoes? Let me know in the comments below. Would you like me to find another survival story from this era to script for you?